So can we start?
All is good.
Everybody's here. Okay. So for the new faces, welcome to the conference Creativity and Innovation in Theater, Media and Culture Production, Visions and Values for the Future. My name is Nina Mihalinac, and I'm an assistant professor of cultural policy and management at the Department for Theater, Radio and Culture at the Faculty of Drama that organizes this conference. And I'm also the head of the UNESCO chair in cultural policy and management at the University of Arts, Belgrade. As you may know, our conference is organized by the occasion of the 60th anniversary of our department. And today we have an honor to welcome Dr. Jenny Mbaye from the City University of London as a keynote speaker. But before presenting Jenny, I would like to share an interesting fact that both our universities and faculties, the Faculty of Drama Arts and the City University of London, have established departments for cultural policy and management in the 60s, and that we are amongst the first in the world who started exploring the fields of cultural management and cultural policy on the academic level. So we may say that today is also a symbolic historical event for us, for our faculties to meet. Professor Mbaye does research in cultural policy and governance, creative economy, and labor in relation to urban creativity, development, and transformation in African contexts. Her work focuses on urban popular cultures, entrepreneurship, and the music economy in Francophone West Africa. And the title of her lecture today is Cultural Policy, Governance, and the Art for Understanding What Works. So I'm very eager to hear some of the answers quoted in the title. So how does it work? So Jenny, please, you can start sharing your presentation and give a lecture that can last up to 1 hour, but of course it would be better to save time for questions from the audience. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nina, for this warm welcome, and I very much enjoy also the introductory brackets at the beginning in terms of the relationships between our departments that pursue as well in the work of certain of faculty members. I'm a close colleague of Milena as well, who's been joining as on different projects. So thanks for this introduction. I'm Jenny Mbaye, and I'm very, very honored to be joining the conversation today. I hope to be sharing some content that will be both useful to the reflection that you've been having so far and that you will pursue in the afternoon and the next day. So many thanks for this invitation, and also well, celebrations are due. So happy birthday to the Management and Production in Theatre, Radio and Culture department. Well done. 60 years is not small. It's, you know, going over at least 2 Saturn returns for whatever it means. So well done. I dropped the witch hats, and today, as Nina reminded us, I'd like to share some reflections on cultural policy, on governance, and the arts of understanding what works. And this reflection is really a way for me to start discussing the art of developing an acute, a grounded and educated understanding of who and what works in the cultural and creative sphere. And I guess one of my arguments here is that there is a need for critical understanding of these actors and their practices, but also that this understanding, this critical understanding, is one of the greatest challenges for cultural policy and governance. So my argument will unfold in three dimensions. Will be kind of threefold argument, and following also the guidance of the title provided for the conference. I thought it's important when we touch on issues related to creativity and to innovation to pay attention to the role of policy and policy making. And this conversation can never stand far away from these debates, especially under crisis, especially and beyond. The second sub-argument, or let's say the second part of the argument I'd like to make, is when we talk about cultural production, we need to pay attention to the governance structure, to the governance dynamics, and in a way recognizing the multi-layered network of individuals that participate and entities that participate in this ecosystem. And so, again, that's a gesture that allows us to move away from an understanding of cultural production starting from this creative individual genius and looking at the collective and resocializing creativity in a way. And third, it's a reflection on visions and values and how creating visions and value and sustaining certain values calls for an appreciation and a development of an acute understanding. And when I think of understanding, obviously, developing an understanding is never far away from developing appropriate support mechanism that's in a way sustain the approach, the conceptualization, and the understanding as such. There is also a hidden agenda to my agenda, and however comprehensive already this threefold argument is, I do not intend to speak for a full hour, so we'll hopefully we'll have time for conversation afterwards. But one of the underground objective and aim is to be able to speak from my experience, to be able to speak from my knowledge, which is grounded in on the African continent mostly. And so I will be bringing examples, illustrations to what I put forward from both West and East Africa, and as much as possible also from the continent at large. So Pan-African initiatives. And this because, again, I believe in the capacity for other geographies to speak back to this so-called global north, which again is diverse, which again is not homogeneous, but we see a kind of a tendency, trends in terms of this kind of conversational dynamics. So first, the idea around policy making and the idea of rehabilitating in a way the role of policy, or at least not forgetting about this role of cultural policy, is one that calls for looking at how policy is always something that drew from specific value choices. This is a vision, and that is implemented by some form of actions. What is important to retain here is that, well, it is about protecting what is valued. It is about improving generally the welfare of citizens, and more often than not, trying to support what works. Policy is never far from politics and a certain conception of the public. So the public is at core here, the public interest, the public good, understanding that policies has a key role to play in terms of the democratic mandates that have been given. But policy is always a political product in the sense that it involves a composite ecosystem of partners from very different walk of lives. So especially when we look at the cultural and creative scene, we look at transversal and multiscalar forms of action, that is to say, across different ministries, across different departmental infrastructure. We can't talk about culture without talking about education, information, etc., finance, but also different scales from local governments to more regional scale and international scale. I was referring before to one of the professors in your faculty, Milena, who's part of this group of experts for the convention 2005. And so the convention is one of these intergovernmental, so international scale influence that impact on policymaking. But also transversal in terms of the different entities, whether we talk about formal or informal participants or organizations, whether we talk about profit or not-for-profits, mainstream and independent, subsidized recipients or commercial enterprises, the ecosystem of partners, the dialogue interlocutors are multiple. And so it means there is a real challenge in terms of articulating common grounds between what may at times be very distinctive entities, and to try to unify, at least in some sort of direction, if policy is a direction, is about giving a direction, unify multiple and at times even dissident voices. One point that is essential to retain when we look at policy is that there are very different ways of doing policy. There are different styles, there are different regimes, there are different approaches to policy making. And this is because, again, it is embedded in time and place. It is context dependent. And I'm saying, here again, I'm stating some things that may be very quite obvious for us who are bathing really in those conversations. But it's quite key to remind how imports are not as easily done, and translation, the work of translation is quite key. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about just about the language, but also the language within the language, and the importance, hence, of reminding the focus on what is rather than on what should be. And so this obviously reminds us of not only the role of policymaking, but how challenges are attached to policymaking. And whether it's in terms of issues of power, issues of authority, there are different, not all voices are equally valued. And sometimes it's true, external voices may have more resonance to the ears of policymakers than inside and internal voices and contributions. And so these issues of stemming from what is rather than what should be really speaks back to this, speaks back to learning how to value those voices, those contributions from within. And the last point, and again, that I want to kind of, as a reminder, but this has already been heavily digested, is how we're talking about, when we talk about policy, especially in relation to the cultural and creative sectors, we're talking about this extraordinary commodity. We're talking about, yes, something that can be traded, that can be sold, that can be bought, that can bring economic value, but and also that requires some economic arrangements, that requires some workers' arrangements in terms of social security, etc. So looking at it from a very business side of the culture. but also it's something that has this extra dimension that is loaded with identity, that is loaded with values, that is loaded with meaning. And in this sense, this is not policy that can be simply reduced to market transactions, but needs to move beyond. Moving beyond and also recognizing some of the limitations that that policy making as a process may entail. Moving beyond is about also and essentially recognizing the capabilities that are, again, from within. This is a concept that I developed and suggested with a colleague, Cecilia Dinardi, around the cultural polis. And it's really about reclaiming a focus on the soft resources, reclaiming a focus on the linking value, on the glue, on the imagination of human bodies that constitute a given territory. It's about reaffirming the knowledge and concern of its citizenry. And this questions something that I will go back to when dealing with the third layer on really understanding and developing an understanding and support for the sector. This really goes hand in hand with an understanding of the power of local capacity building and capabilities. Really recognizing that if we are facing an ecosystem that is that involves multiple stakeholders, we are also looking at finding ways to incorporate those voices, finding ways to integrate new users, to integrate new partners easily and quickly. Again, this calls for the recognition that each of those people, entities that participate in the policymaking process have a spatial literacy of the sector, have a very distinctive understanding and appreciation of the sector, have both tacit and informed knowledge of the sector. And so it's not to say that everyone, again, will be able to speak. Obviously, who speaks, who's heard, whose knowledge is being accounted for is always depending on this power struggle that is making cultural policy and policy in general, any public policy in general. However, it's about recognizing how there is more and more possibilities for creating new type of public spaces, therefore reinvesting the value of having a proper agora as we understanding, that is to say, an open public space for conversation. So it is about here reclaiming civic gathering and assembling, reclaiming place for performing citizenship, which can inform social conversation and political action. An example that I want to share with you are twofold. As I said, drawing on the experience that I had the honor and privilege to confront myself with on the African continent, I'd like to share two Pan-African initiatives. So they're very different in their content and in their format, as well as in the people that animate them. Those two, however, illustration gives us an indication of what is meant by the role of policy making, but also what is essential in terms of the recognition of those internal voices, of those contributions from within that, you know, just emerge and grasp the scene of the conversation. the space of conversation. So the first example, the first illustration that I'd like to share is the Africa Tech and Creative Group, ATC, which really emerged in response to the African Continental Free Trade Area. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is a free trade area, as it says, but that puts that is outlined in an agreement that 54 out of the 55 African Union nations have signed. It is one of the largest, it is actually the largest in the world in terms of participating countries since the formation of the World Trade Organization over 2 decades ago, and has the potential of bringing about 1.2 billion Africans together on the same market. So the implementation of this agreement is something huge. It's something that will be boosting intra-area trade, create jobs, enhance skill developments, and really encourage the free movement of goods, products, and services made in Africa. And so one thing that was interesting is that the ATCG, so the Africa Tech and Creative Group, was created in a way to remind and to intervene in this huge economic forum about the importance of, let me move things here, I don't know if you see that or not. Of the importance of taking actions in terms of this massive market development, taking actions in terms of tech and creative industries. And so it was really about trying to mobilize different hubs, co-working spaces, different types of organization and institutions throughout the continent to build a strong lobby force that is able of making an advocacy for what tech and creative industry will need and how this African continental free trade area can work for those businesses. And so it was, again, a way of showing how civil society organizations, and I'll come back to that in a minute, mobilize themselves to provide another narrative, and if policies about vision and action, different visions, different perspectives, so the implementation is comprehensive enough so to include sectors like tech and the creative industries. And doing so, they were also drawing on their own approach, on the very distinctive approach that characterizes the sector in terms of storytelling and in terms of media engagement. I will drop this kind of snapshots, illustrative snapshots here and there. The second snapshot that I want to share, and again, this is to illustrate this issue of cultural policy. I want to share one of the Arterial African Creative Cities Network, which was a pilot program that took place between 2016 and 2018 under the presidency of Mahmoud Affe, who was then the president of the steering committee of Arterial Network, which is a Pan-African network that put together organizations, very different types, again, of organizations working in the cultural and creative sector. And this Pan-African network had this initiative of trying to propose an alternative to what was then the only other network alike, which is the UNESCO Creative Cities Network, which at the time, when we started to think the project 2015, only one country on the whole continent was declared as creative city per se. It was Aswan in Egypt in art craft. And so it was in a way of, since then there are many others who have joined. But at the time there was a genuine reflection of this is not that there are no creativity on the African continent. It's maybe that we need to formulate it differently. And maybe we need to come up with something that may be at a different scale, lower scale, but that will work and make sense for practitioners of the sector. And that was basically what this network, which is again from the civil society, that is from non-profit, not-for-profit sector, but with organizations that are very different from within, decided to implement. And so this Arterial African Creative Cities Network, this pilot program, was drawing on the experience of Ségou, which is a secondary city in Mali that has really managed to impose itself on both the West African, the continental, and the global cultural map in terms of the decentralization of the cultural offer and cultural proposition that it achieves through the creation of its festivals, through the creation of its cultural centers. And that's an example I'll come back to. But what the idea behind it is this Mahmoud Afé, then president of Arterial Network, who's from Ségou and who really pushed forward the agenda of culture and cultural policy among policymakers locally and other practitioners locally. Develop a kind of a model or develop a kind of inspiration that was deemed to be shared with other countries. And what was interesting, it was shared with countries that are not the usual suspects on any African creative cultural map. We're not talking about, Cape Town or Cairo or Dakar, but we were talking about Harare in Zimbabwe, Pointe-Noire in Republic of Congo, Victoria in Seychelles, and Nouakchott in Mauritania. And the idea behind this, this project was really to draw on the successful experience of Ségou to suggest or accompany different cities in endogenous incremental developments of a program that will be focusing on sustainable cultural development for the city. And the way it was done, it was really by choosing cities where you already have active cultural practitioners, active cultural workers, who would be able to anchor the conversation, welcome the conversation. And the launch would be organized on the margin of a flagship event that the host would do. And so the aim was really to facilitate cooperation and partnerships between local authorities, local public servants, local public institutions, and the civil society by the presence of kind of a third party, the network, the Arterial Network. And to really encourage and strengthen the engagement and the commitment of civil society. So really it was about shedding light on what urban creativity could do and working with different partners from the city itself to start to devise what a cultural policy, or at least a cultural strategy for the city could look like and how it could be implemented. And so, as I mentioned, it was really about organizing a launch about this, this network, and then ensuring that this launch was concretized by workshops that invited different participants from the civil society, but across different sectors. So, for instance, in Pointe Noire, the host was someone from theater. And so the Yarrow Center, which was the host, with its Tsangu Tsangu Festival, was receiving or welcoming different members from the civil society, different members from design, from literature, from music, from different sectors and disciplines, to have a conversation. And this conversation was, again, not only facilitated by the presence of a third party, but was also facilitated by the perspective of speaking back to local policymakers, which again was facilitated by the presence of a third party. So the objective with this pilot program was really about advocacy, was really about capacity building, was really about networking. And it translated into something that is still alive today, which is a Creative Cities Exchange circuit, which allows for the exchange of, especially when we know the challenge of the mobility of artists, which translate into the exchange of artists, of products, of performances between those cities. And so this is something that really, again, illustrates how cultural exchanges can strengthen not only local, but also in a translocal way, different sectors, supports the elaboration also of a reflection and programmatic actions towards the elaboration of cultural policy in long term. And today we can see how this has also translated into something that belongs to the field of education and training. And that's something on which I'll be concluding. But for now, just the simple fact of having artist exchanges, circuit touring, co-creation, co-productions of cultural products is quite key. We can see here how policy, and again, I'm reminding of this sentence from Miller and Udise, who used to say that to know cultural policies and intervening in it is important, because at the end of the day, resistance goes nowhere if it's not, if it doesn't take hold institutionally. And so one cannot think of this kind of resistance strategy of counter-narrative, counter-propositions without thinking of an effective framework that welcome them, that embrace them, whether it's in terms of the the Africa Tech and Creative Industry Group, or whether it's in terms of the Arterial African Creative Cities Network. These are all initiatives that in the long run will need to find some form of welcoming part from the institutions themselves. And that's where the questions of governance pose itself very seriously. It poses itself very seriously, and in the context in which I chose to base the reflection, it's also a context where governance doesn't have necessarily a strong anchorage from the beginning. There are some form of what might be called colonial hangovers, whereby our institutions are still marked by a legacy in which especially for Francophone African countries, in which very little importance were placed on private initiatives, were placed on alternative voices, were placed on, at times, dissident voices, were placed on those other contributions to the policy making practice that do not come from public institutions. And this means that in terms of the centralization and the omnipotency and omnipotence of the states in those debates didn't make much room for other participants to the conversation. And so here the question of governance poses itself quite tangibly, especially as, in contrast to this kind of legacy, in contrast to this colonial hangover, the largest part of the creative economy on the continent lies outside the public regulatory control, lies outside the state regulatory control. And in fact, most activities are done by freelancers or micro-enterprises. And so something that the perspective on governance calls for us to appreciate even more is how this question is essentially relational and contingent. So in our context, there is a huge work in terms of acknowledging the potential of cultural invention and collective creation, led by informed and concerned citizens. But also, there is still minimal, like, baby steps taken in terms of accepting what's the fact that local authorities or public authorities often don't understand and even know nothing about some of the processes that they're supposed to regulate. And so recognizing the relational nature of governance allows us to, again, anchor the conversation in context and embedded in time and place, but also recognize that, again, stemming from what is rather than what should be, that key partners to the conversations are those civil society organizations, are those stakeholders, are those governing agents that exist beyond the state. And so we can see, and again, I'll be sharing some example, we can see the key role that they come to play, whether they, in terms of collecting data on the sector, whether it's in terms of sharing and circulating evidence to inform policymakers. Because as we saw, again, even though policy is a political product, this is something that that is not necessarily only based on evidence, but the work of public opinion and other type of influence play also a key role in this negotiation process. It remains important to be able to document and to inform conversations and perspective. And so we can see how practitioners have been extremely active in providing alternative perspective, providing alternative discourses and narrative, and do so by organizing specific spaces for exchange and different ways of campaigning, of building advocacy work and material. In doing so, these partners or these governing agents ensure that the concerns of artists and cultural professionals are not only heard, but they have the means to pursue the creation, the production, reproduction, dissemination and consumption and access of their activities and creative work and expressions. So here is, and I'm also conscious of time, so I'm gonna also speed up a bit. So here is a second concept that I'd like to put forward, which is the one of alternative institution building. Koyo Kuo, that I quoted earlier on the monopolistic nature of the state in terms of the cultural production, came up with this understanding of arts institution building as becoming key, and in the way that they were not only restructuring but also reshaping the sector and the field of cultural production. This is something that can be equated to what the urbanist Ananya Roy would call the civic governmentality, which speaks back to this dialectical movement between insurgency and institutionalization in a context where government do not necessarily have the capacities, technical, personal, fiscal, financial, to intervene in the sector as needed. And so we can see how here there's organization that we can raise as, that we can make an argument in terms of raising them as institutions, how this organization sees this question of public good and public interest and really invest the public realm by building on the wasteland of policymakers. And they do so by suggesting new forms of working, new forms of producing. I think one thing that we can notice how they are able to develop innovations and new ways of approaching the field thanks to their proximity with the sector. They know their audience intimately. They are able to connect it directly with the environment, and that in sense are capable of birthing individually tailored solutions to problems that they have themselves identified. This speaks back to this issue of spatial literacy that I was mentioning before. In doing so, they really affirm the political responsibility, but also allow for new imagination, for new reinvention, for new engagement also across divisions and across borders and boundaries of a mental construct and conditionings that didn't allow for an informed and grounded understanding of what was happening in the sector. And an example of this can be found in a collective that I'm a big fan of, which is the Nest Collective. The Nest Collective is based in Nairobi, in Kenya. And they started as a community of artists or arts people who are passionate about art and artistic practices, and who really build up this collective as a way of reflecting and proposing alternative stories about what it is to be from Nairobi, who are the people from Nairobi, and what the African future holds for its residents and its citizens. And it was really about, connecting both the Kenyan young men and audiences, but also to connect them with the rest of the world through arts, whether it's video, whether it's design, whether it's fashion, whether it's music. You can see like it is a strong collective. While I'm talking about the Nest Collective, is that they have really become this, in a way, this this institution since 2012 when they were created. Maybe some of you have heard, read, seen one of the queer anthology film stories about lives. This one won numerous awards. And so what I'm referring to the Nest Collective is that they really imposed themselves both on the East African, but also on the African continent in general, as an institution capable of providing alternative and counterbalancing certain visions of African and African youth and African artistic scenes. Yet they didn't stop there. And in 2013, they created the HIVA Fund. And the HIVA Fund, while the Nest Collective were more investing in the creative output, the HIVA Fund was really about looking at the ecosystem of the output, of those creative output, and is actually the first in Africa, the first creative business fund of its kind. It intervenes through grants, funds, through trainings, through workshops, through capacity building, through research and publications. And it was really one way to strengthen the livelihoods of East Africa's creative entrepreneurs. And so many of the members of the Nest Collective are actually part of the HIVA Fund. You can find them. But it's interesting to see how there is another type of institutionalization that took place with the creation of this fund. In 2020, they were among the first to release this reflection and thorough analysis of the sector, COVID-19 resilience, creative industry options and strategies, that really looked at the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, generating responses for over 500 creative and cultural industry practitioners, and looking at different engaging with different industry leaders who were able to see and show and contrast the impact of the pandemic for the different sectors on in the Kenyan landscape. And so it was really, again, a way to usher in a new frontier in economic support and development for cultural and creative industries in context. So what Koyo, and again, I'm going back to this curator, and it's very, very also important for me here to quote curators, arts curators, Koyo Kuo, who used to have this space for arts and the city in Dakar, Raw Material Company, is now the director of the Zeiss Museum, Contemporary Art Museum in Cape Town. And so it's very important to have the voice of those practitioners teach us, speak to us, and educate us on how to learn and read the sector, both in terms of its governance, in terms of its policy, and in terms of apprehending and comprehending it well. So what Koyo reminds us here is how instituting something allows the inscription in time of the change that you want to see in the word. I revamped her quote, but basically that's my translation of it. And so to bring all that up, what does that mean? Why is it important? My talk was a beautiful typo in it. I'm still yet a francophone speaking English at the Serbian conference, so I guess it's okay. About the art of understanding what works. drew from this note that the Ministry of Culture in 2013 in Senegal said that his work is to accompany and support what already works. And so that's how I translated in terms of understanding. And this understanding really calls for going beyond this individual creative genius, recognizing the overall ecosystem of interconnected activities. So I put like here some graphs that we found in the UN, United Nations literature, whether UNCTAD or UNESCO, that shows how there's a core creative arts and all those cycle that expands the different participants in the sector, but also that there is this whole cycle of production, from creation to making to distributing, exchanging, and archiving, and there is still a limited understanding of how all those spaces are branching out into other activities. I'll share just after a quick graph from one of my colleagues, Andy Pratt, that show how spread those activities are. But what I want to share here, or what I want to remind here, is how by reminding all those, of the ecosystem and of the cycle, it's a way of uncovering how creativity works, but also of recentering the debates on the creatives themselves as key intermediaries. And that's the key word that I'd like to conclude on. How often we see policymakers and governments who kind of misidentify the aspiration of creative workers, of creatives in general, and not just the artists, obviously. And in doing so, they fail to see the creative practices in front of them. Again, speaking back to working from what is rather than what should be, and starting with a spatial literacy from different perspectives and angles. And often those agencies that are supposedly in charge of identifying, registering the experience of this creative sector lack experience in terms of interacting and understanding the creative communities. And again, as I said, it is overwhelmingly spread. So this is in relation to the music sector, and I don't want even to spend time on this, but it's just to show how the work of supporting and understanding is massive, because it involves many ramifications. So that's where I suggest something that I made, that was suggested before, that I suggested elsewhere, the importance of make and shifts. And so as much as makeshift in one word is the idea of a temporary inferior condition, to make and shift is really to subvert this idea and to recognize a new way of life, if you want. So how people can make the best of and have been making the best of local resources in order to go on. And I'm borrowing from this term from Abdul-Malik Simon and Edgar Peterson. And so we can see how make and shifts call for anchoring anew and developing different ways of capacity building mechanisms. It's about building institutions, and again, this word is important, that are alternatives, for instance, to the project-based economy. In the sense, there are spaces that are open every day for the business of culture, for the cause of arts and culture, and that keeps on going despite and across crisis, environmental, health, political, and that remain key spaces in terms of propositions, imagination, experimentation, and spaces in some where people can converge and dialogue and converse, again, fostering this publicness of the conversation. And these are also spaces that are funded on an emotional capacity. And so this is where authors like Mark Vance have been expanding a lot on those more ways of acting towards the others. So it's not just about obviously the business of culture, but it's also about balancing those instrumental and non-instrumental values. It's about reinvesting the morality of collaboration, participation, and mediation. Again, a term that it's more and more important to my reflection analysis, and to contribute as such to the vibrancy of their creative scenes. And to conclude, that's the last example that I want to share. I started to mention it before, which is the Festival sur le Niger in Ségou, in Mali, a secondary city located 2-3 hours drive in the direction of Timbuktu, which 2005 created a festival to kind of decentralize and delocate the offer in terms of cultural participation and cultural enjoyment, but also cultural production. Fast forward, they created a CPL, and that's something that in Habitat's publication on culture, urban futures, you can find an interesting analysis of their CPL, which is a council that is devoted to local economic development. And that was created basically as a public-private partnership that lobbied for the inclusion of culture and art in the reflection of urban development. So this was done as part as well of creative Ségou initiatives that had many folds, many aspects. Why I'm referring to the Festival sur le Niger, to the foundation du Festival sur le Niger or the Ségou Art, is that they kept on, again, anchoring the conversation, anchoring this open space, anchoring the public debate in bricks and buildings, but also in the networks that they were creating. And one of the most recent network, besides the one that I mentioned before around the creative circuit, is the one of the ICAM, the Institute Corée for the Arts and Professions. And that's recently created a master. And so what is interesting to see with this
sorry, I have to interrupt you.
Yes.
Because of the time, the time is up, but we have a 10 minutes break within the conference that can be used for questions from the audience. Merci beaucoup pour toutes les informations that you gave us that were very, very insightful and inspirational, and they opened a lot of paths for further research for us, because these are all new examples from majority of us, I think. So did you want, so now, from now on, from this moment on, we have 8 minutes more. Did you want to give a certain point of the lecture, final conclusion, or we can ask the audience for questions?
I'm happy to ask the audience for questions, and while they raise their hands and write them down, I think the only thing that I'll be concluding on is this role of creative intermediaries, those curators or educators, and how they not only contribute to the resilience, but also play a key role in terms of brokerage, in terms of translation, in terms of problem solving and network building. And so I think these are again rehabilitating those players in the conversation, both around policy, but also around governance.
Okay, thank you. I have one question for you that I find personally important, but I will give the floor to the audience if somebody has a question, a comment. We have a space for 1 or 2 questions for now. So you can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat. Or if not, I will pose the question to Jenny. Okay. Maybe it will be a difficult one. I'm not sure how much the topic of the non-aligned is present, of the non-aligned movement is present in your research, in the history books, and so on and so forth. But since this year is the year when also we celebrate 60 years of the non-aligned movement, and in Belgrade we have a museum of African history. What do you think for the perspective, for the future of the world, which is entering in a new Cold War and so on and so forth? Can this network or the heritage of the non-aligned be used for future cultural cooperation and future actions?
Thanks for this very current but yet not easy question, Nina. I would answer by saying that many of the responses lies in the practice of current operators and practitioners, and so these are things that are, you know, not only possible but that might already be done somehow, somewhere. So I'm thinking, I gave the example of the Festival sur le Niger, I gave the example of the Nest Collective. They're also part of this network, not really formalized network, that is exploring the Lumpung practice, that comes from Indonesia, from another collective, which is the Ruan Grupa collective. And so there are bridges that are being made. There are, if you want, work of solidarities, experience of solidarities that are being created, or networks of solidarities through solidarities of experience, of past experience. And so they may not have the same affiliation label that the non-aligned movement would, 60 years ago would have, but there are still those traces of building bridges, creating synergies through this commonness of the experience, or at least alignment of experience somehow. And so I think it's for instance, it's very interesting because in the example I just gave of the Lumpung practice initiated by Ruan Grupa is currently the artistic director of the Documenta in Kassel. And so we can see again how this kind of new synergies, new collaborations, new trajectories can speak back on what used to be the colonizers' territories. So it's very interesting to see this kind of subaltern resistance through the workings and of such kind of collaborations.
Thank you. We're just part of the Erasmus project, which has the topic on producing subaltern knowledge in cultural management and cultural policy. So at one point we will invite you and include you in this work. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much for the audience for being present. And I wish you the best of luck in your future work, Jenny. And to our listeners, please continue on participating in the conference.
And thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much. So now